Assalamu alaikum. Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. You know all these names. You know these titans of the civil rights movement. But I doubt you know the names Robert Walker and Ethel Cole. Robert Walker and Ethel Cole were sanitation workers working in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. Life for African American sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968 was very difficult. They were the lowest of the low in Memphis, a southern town. They were treated as bad as the trash that they hauled. They were spat upon, despised. The state refused to allow them to organize, to form a union, to speak up, to stand up for themselves. And on February 1st, 1968, in a very tragic accident, because the employers of the sanitation workers refused to give them safe working conditions, these two men got dragged into a trash compactor while gathering garbage, and they were crushed to death. And it was their death that started the Memphis sanitation workers strike. You've heard of the Selma strikes, the marches in Montgomery, but you probably haven't heard much about the Memphis sanitation workers. But if you think about the date, February 1st, 1968, and what that's leading towards, it'll dawn on you this is why Martin Luther King was in Memphis in 1968. After the sanitation workers died on February 1st, it happened to be the same day in Memphis that Lisa Marie Presley was born. And as you might imagine, the birth of Lisa Marie Presley took up the entire front page of the Memphis Commercial Appeal. The deaths of these two African-American sanitation workers were little blurbs on the back page of the newspaper. But their deaths sparked a series of events that led Martin Luther King Jr. to be in Memphis in early April 1968. After the men died, the sanitation workers stood up for themselves, and they started to organize. They refused to go to work for 1 day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks. 2 weeks into it, the trash was growing around everybody's house, and the white people were getting madder and madder as no one picked up their trash. How dare they not pick up our trash? The city went to court, tried to compel them to work. And eventually there were 1,300 African-American sanitation workers all on strike. They refused to work. They started walking up and down Memphis every day. They had a protest every day, and they carried placards, and on these placards were 4 simple words. And the 4 simple words were, "I am a man." They were sick and tired of not having their humanity recognized. On February 22nd, 3 weeks after the men died, the city council, sick of being recipients of all these complaints about the trash, voted to allow them to unionize. The white mayor vetoed their vote. And that is what led Martin Luther King to come visit Memphis. He didn't know it at the time, but James Earl Ray was on his trail, had been on his trail for a couple of months, and had in fact already bought the rifle that he was going to use to kill Reverend Martin Luther King. On March 18, 1968, 16 days before he died, Reverend King spoke to a crowd of 25,000, and he applauded and saluted the work that they had done. And he gave this quote. He said, "You are demonstrating that we can stick together. You are demonstrating that we are all tied in a single garment of destiny, and that if one black person suffers, if one black person is down, we are all down." 10 days later, the protest continued every day. There was a march down Beale Street every day, right down the center of Memphis. On March 28th, 22,000 kids skipped school, and thousands of others joined them. Martin Luther King was there for that, and it was one of the very few protests that he ever had that turned into a mob. A Black Power group, a precursor to the Black Panthers, was there, and they really caused a lot of trouble, and Reverend King was very much embarrassed by what happened, and it was one of his worst days as a leader. So they asked him to come back again, and he did on April 3rd. And you've probably heard excerpts of that speech that he gave on April 3rd, the night before he died. It was a cold night in Memphis, and he was sick. And he gave a speech the night before he was assassinated. And he said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." And I tell you this story not to talk about Martin Luther King as much as I admire him, but more to mention and to remind us of the struggle of African Americans that came before us. They stood up. They stood as men and women, and they said, "We're not going to take this anymore." 44 years later, a different group stands at the center of the civil rights struggle. We now live in a world where it's okay to have Burn a Quran Day. We live in a world where it's okay for a well-established presidential candidate to say, "No Muslims in my cabinet if I get elected." We live in a world where a congressman can hold sham hearings, show trials. And we're in a world now where perpetuating Islamophobia in a so-called neutral way by opposing things like the so-called Ground Zero Mosque is acceptable. We live in a world now where the FBI is allowed to spy on the Muslims at their places of worship and at their so-called outreach meetings. So I ask you, who is it that stands up for the Muslims now? It is the Council on American-Islamic Relations. My name is Jim Hacking, and I helped, along with Kamal Yassin, Amani Ragab, Arslan Iftikhar, Hashim Raza, and Aisha Sultan, start the St. Louis chapter of CAIR here a year before 9/11. And the organization has stood for Muslims around the country, and CAIR is the organization that stands up for Muslims better than anybody else, and they've been doing it for years. You're going to hear later from Ibrahim Hooper, and Ibrahim Hooper and Nihad Awad started CAIR many, many years ago. And in case you didn't know, I wasn't born Muslim. I became Muslim in 1998. Back then, Brother Kamal Yassin would print out the faxes from CAIR in DC. There was no internet. There was no email. Brother Kamal would print out these faxes and he'd deliver them to West Pine Masjid and Dar al-Salam, and he would get up after Salat and he'd read some of the announcements. This is how we got our news about the Muslim issues of the day. That was it. That's what we had for communication. So upon becoming Muslim, the very first thing I did was send in my money to join the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Because I knew, even before 9/11, that Muslims were going to need to have their rights protected. I knew that we have to organize, and I knew that we had to stand together. And that is why we helped start the chapter, and that is why the chapter over the last couple of years has been reborn through the efforts of people like Anjem Sharif, Brother Kamal, Faizan Saeed, and Akbar Chisti. So I'm not going to go on all night. I'm really the MC. I just gave a little introduction to let you know how much I care about CAIR. And we're not asking you to go out on strike. We're not asking you to stand up as those strong people in the 1960s that standing in front of police officers with batons and guns and shields and dogs barking at them, fire hoses. No one's asking us to do that anymore. Would we do that now for our fellow Muslims? I don't know. I think we live in a world now that's so much softer than the people that lived in the 1960s knew. I don't know if we would do that. But what I do know is that if anyone's going to protect us, if anyone's going to stand up for us, it's CAIR. And at the end of the day, we're all going to have to ask ourselves, can we answer the quote of Martin Luther King? Can we say that we are demonstrating that we can stick together? Can we demonstrate that we Muslims are all tied together in a single garment of destiny, and that if one Muslim suffers, if one Muslim is down, we are all down. All right. At this time, I'd like to introduce Brother Faizan Saeed. Faizan is the current Executive Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations, St. Louis. He was born in Lahore, Pakistan, but grew up here in St. Louis all his life. Kirkwood High School, right? Mm-hmm. He received his degree at Drake University in politics and history and minored in astronomy